The scent of hay and horse was the first thing Alara knew each morning. A thick perfume that clung to her clothes, her hair, the very walls of the stable she called home. In the isolated village of Havenwood, nestled in a valley perpetually choked by mist, tradition was a chain as tangible as iron, and hers was the heaviest of all. As the last of her bloodline, her life was not her own. It belonged to the great, breathing creatures she tended, a duty passed down through 10 generations with the grim certainty of a curse. Her day began before the weak sun could penetrate the forest's dense canopy. She moved through the familiar routine with a practiced, if pained, grace. A subtle but persistent limp accompanied her steps, a legacy of a spine that curved just slightly wrong. Her hands, as they brushed down the flank of a broad-chested draft horse named Oak, were her most telling feature. The fingers were too long, the joints too prominent, moving with an unnatural, spidery delicacy as they worked a knot from the animal's winter coat. A nervous twitch, a quick, involuntary jerk of her head, would occasionally break her concentration, a physical echo of the restless energy that thrummed beneath her skin. The horses were her sole companions, their silent understanding a comfort and a prison. They accepted her without question, their warm, dark eyes holding no judgment for her elongated fingers or her uneven gait. At night, she did not retreat to a cottage like the other villagers. Her bed was a pile of fresh straw in the farthest stall, shared with a gentle mare named Willow for warmth, as the tradition demanded. The practice was as old as Havenwood itself, a sacred rite of bonding that began as necessity and had ossified into unbreakable law. Lying beside the animal, feeling the powerful rhythm of its heart and the heat of its body, Alara felt a profound connection, but also a deep, cellular wrongness, as if her own blood was whispering a warning she could not decipher. In the quiet hours, when the only sounds were the soft crunch of hay and the sigh of the wind through the stable walls, her mind would wander from the confines of her duty. She dreamed of escape, not to a grand city or a life of luxury, but simply to a place where her body was her own, where her nights were spent in silence and solitude, not in the company of beasts. She imagined walking on a road that did not circle back to the stable, feeling solid, level earth under her feet without the hitch in her step. These visions were as vivid as they were treacherous, flashes of a freedom that felt like a betrayal of her ancestors, of her name, of the very horses who nuzzled her hand with trusting affection. The conflict was a constant ache, a hollow space between her ribs that the warmth of the horses could not fill. She was the last heir, the culmination of a lineage bound to the soil and the stable. Her deformities were not mere flaws. They were insignia, the physical proof of her inheritance. Each twitch, each limping step, was a reminder that her destiny was woven into the very straw she slept on. A future as predetermined and inescapable as the rising mist that sealed Havenwood from the world each dawn. The past was not a story in Havenwood. It was a living thing, as palpable as the morning frost and as heavy as the stones in the hearth. For Alara, it was a weight carried in her bones, a history written in the curve of her spine and the length of her fingers. It was Elder Kale who gave this weight a voice, his presence a bridge to the forgotten world that had forged their present. He found her one evening, not in the stable, but at the edge of the whispering woods, her gaze fixed on the path that led away from everything she had ever known. He did not speak at first, simply settled his aged frame onto a fallen log, the gnarled wood of his walking stick looking like an extension of his own knotted hand. The fire in his eyes had dimmed with the years, but a deep, unsettling knowledge still smoldered within. He followed her gaze to the horizon, to the world beyond their mist-shrouded valley, and he began to speak, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, weaving the tapestry of their beginning. He told her of a time 10 generations past, of a winter so brutal it was remembered only as the Great White. The cold was a predator, sharp-toothed and relentless, stealing into cottages and snuffing out lives with an indifferent breath. The founder of their line, a man named Alistair, was a pragmatist, a survivor hardened by the unforgiving land. He kept a great, shaggy workhorse in his own small hut, a beast of immense strength and fortitude named Tor. As the frost deepened and the wind screamed through the cracks in the walls, Alistair made a choice born not of ritual, but of raw, desperate need. One night, with the cold threatening to claim him, he led Tor from the corner of the room and laid his own pallet of furs beside the animal. He pressed himself against the horse's broad, warm flank, burying his face in the coarse hair, stealing the life-giving heat that radiated from the massive body. It was an act of pure survival, a transaction between two creatures fighting the same elemental foe. There was no bond of strength in that first night, only the stark, shivering gratitude for a warmth that kept death at bay. The practice continued through the long months of the Great White. What began as a nightly act of desperation slowly morphed into a habit, and then into something more. The other settlers, seeing that Alistair alone among them thrived, his vitality undiminished by the cold, began to emulate him. They spoke of a newfound resilience, a fortitude that seemed to flow from the horses into their own bodies. They called it the bond, a sacred sharing of strength that had seen them through the darkest season. But Cale's voice grew quieter, his gaze turning inward as he recounted the subtle shifts that followed. He spoke of the unease that flickered in the eyes of the women, of the way conversations would falter when Alistair entered the communal hall. There was an unspoken tension, a taboo that had not yet found its name. Sharing a roof with an animal was one thing. Sharing a bed, night after night, the line between man and beast blurring in the shared dark, was another. It was a necessary evil that was slowly being polished into a virtue, but the shadow of that original transgression lingered, a faint, dissonant hum beneath the village's newfound lore. It was in this space, between survival and sanctity, that their legacy and Alara's curse had first taken root. Cale's voice did not lift with the telling of a triumphant myth, but deepened, settling into the grim soil of consequence. The fire in the hearth seemed to gutter as he continued, the shadows on the walls stretching like grasping fingers. The Great White had finally retreated, he explained, leaving behind a village saved, but irrevocably changed. The spring that followed was not just a thaw of ice and snow, but a slow, terrible blossoming of the seeds sown in that desperate winter. The first signs emerged with the new generation. The infants, born to the families who had embraced the bed-sharing practice, were healthy and robust, their cries strong. But as they grew, peculiarities surfaced. A child's legs seemed to bow outward, the bones curving in a way that suggested a different kind of weight. Another had a neck that was just a fraction too thick, too muscular. The most telling feature, the one that sent the first true chill of dread through the community, was in the eyes. Some of the children possessed large, liquid brown eyes set a touch too far apart, their gaze possessing a calm, profound depth that was unsettlingly familiar. Alistair, hailed as their savior, watched these developments with a mounting horror that he buried beneath a stoic facade. He saw his own son, a boy with a strong, broad back and a peculiar, rolling gait, and felt a cold knot of guilt tighten in his stomach. The rationalization began slowly, a collective act of will born from the need to justify their survival. The village elders, Alistair among them, began to speak of these features not as deformities, but as marks of the bond. The bowed legs were for stability, the strong necks for endurance, the wide-set eyes for keener sight. They were blessings, they insisted, physical manifestations of the horse's strength woven into their own human line. The practice, once a grim necessity, was now codified, sanctified. It became the ritual, a nightly tradition for every family, a sacred duty to maintain the connection that had saved them. But in the quiet of his own home, the facade crumbled. Alistair would watch his wife, her face etched with a silent, unspoken fear, as she brushed their son's hair. He would see the way the boy preferred to sleep on a pallet of straw rather than a proper bed, and the guilt would become a physical pain. He had saved them from the cold, only to lead them into a different kind of wilderness, one where the boundaries of their very bodies were no longer certain. He had traded one form of death for a slow, creeping transformation, a legacy that was now rooting itself in flesh and bone. The tradition deepened, its roots sinking past memory and into the bedrock of their identity. What had begun as a shared secret for survival was now a public covenant, celebrated and enforced. The unease of the first winter was forgotten, deliberately buried under layers of ritual and doctrine. Yet, for those who looked closely, the signs of a deeper decay were there. The children did not just look different. They sometimes moved with a startled, skittish energy, or stood with a heavy, patient stillness that was not entirely human. The ritual had solidified their community, but it had also locked them onto a path from which there seemed no return. A path whose end was shrouded in a mist far thicker than the one that surrounded Havenwood, foreshadowing a harvest of sorrows yet to be reaped. The consequences of the bond, so carefully rationalized by Alistair's generation, bloomed in full, grotesque flower during the time of Alara's grandfather, Finn. The subtle peculiarities of bowed legs and wide-set eyes were now distant memories, replaced by transformations that could no longer be whispered away as blessings. The village of Havenwood became a gallery of living aberrations, a testament to a pact whose price was paid in flesh and sanity. Finn's generation was marked by a sharp escalation. Where their parents had exhibited softened bones and heightened senses, they displayed malformations that were undeniably equine. Some men, like Borin, who would later become a fearsome elder, walked with a permanent, rolling stoop, their spines curving into a visible, painful arch that strained against their shirts. Their feet were the most damning evidence. Several villagers, including Finn himself, found their toes fusing, the bones hardening and elongating into crude, hoof-like stumps that made the wearing of normal shoes impossible. They took to crafting soft, leather wrappings, but the distinctive, clumsy clip-clop of their gait on the hard-packed earth was a constant, audible reminder of their deviance. The physical toll was matched, and in some cases surpassed, by a creeping mental instability. The calm, profound gaze of the previous generation gave way to flickers of raw animal panic. Men would startle at sudden noises, their entire bodies flinching as if from a whip crack. Periods of sullen, heavy-lidded stillness could erupt without warning into fits of irrational anger, a kicking, snorting fury that left families bruised and bewildered. Whispers of the stable mind began to circulate, a term for the moments when a person's thoughts seemed to scatter and reform not as human reason, but as equine instinct. They would forget words, responding instead with guttural sounds or simple, physical nudges. The shared warmth of the ritual had become a conduit for something far more intimate and terrifying, a slow merging of consciousness. The pinnacle of this horror arrived with the birth of Anwen, the daughter of Finn's cousin. The labor was long and fraught, the midwives emerging from the cottage with faces pale as ash, their hands trembling. They did not bring the swaddled infant to the mother's arms. The child had been born with a fully equine head. A fine, chestnut-brown coat covered the face, the features a perfect, miniature replica of a foal's, complete with soft nostrils and long velvety ears. The body, however, was human, tiny, pink, and horrifically vulnerable. The community's reaction was not one of grief, but of swift, silent erasure. Under the cover of a moonless night, Elder Kale and a few chosen men took the mewling creature from its weeping mother. There was no burial, no marker. The official story, murmured behind closed doors, was that the babe had been stillborn, a tragedy of nature. But everyone knew. The knowledge of Anwen became the village's deepest, most festering secret. A shame so profound it was never spoken aloud, only communicated in the frantic, fearful glances exchanged when a pregnant woman's belly began to swell. The child was hidden away, a living specter that haunted Havenwood more effectively than any ghost, proof that their bloodline was curdling, that the bond was not a blessing but a blight, and that the physical and mental toll of their ancestors' pact was accelerating toward an unthinkable end. The arrival of the outsider was an event as rare and disruptive as a stone cast into the still, deep waters of a forgotten pond. Dr. Liam Eris did not come with fanfare or a large expedition. He arrived alone, his jeep groaning up the treacherous, unpaved track that served as Havenwood's only connection to the world beyond the mist. He was an anthropologist, a student of isolated cultures, and Havenwood was a prize, a community sealed in a time capsule of its own making. His stated purpose, shared with the wary elders who met him at the village edge, was to document their unique traditions, their oral histories, their way of life. But his sharp, observant eyes, the ones that had catalogued rituals from the high Andes to the Siberian tundra, were already seeing past the pleasantries. From the first moment, Havenwood felt different. It was not just the physical isolation, the way the mountains seemed to cup the valley in a possessive hand, or the perpetual haze that blurred the treetops. It was the silence. The village was preternaturally quiet, devoid of the shouting children and casual gossip that characterized most small communities. The people moved with a shared, deliberate slowness, their interactions marked by a profound, unspoken understanding that excluded him completely. Their gazes, when they fell upon him, were not curious but guarded, sliding away the moment he tried to hold them, as if he were seeing something he was not meant to see. What struck him most forcibly, and what immediately piqued his professional curiosity, was the villagers' relationship with their horses. It was not the practical bond of a farmer and his plow horse, nor the affectionate partnership of a rider and her mount. This was something else, something deeper and more unsettling. He saw a young woman not just leading a horse to water, but pressing her forehead against its neck, her lips moving in a silent communication. He saw a man sharing a midday meal, not with his family in his cottage, but seated on a stump in a stable, breaking bread and occasionally offering a crust to the animal standing placidly beside him. The horses were not kept in a separate pasture or barn. They were woven into the very fabric of the village, their presence in yards and even near doorsteps as natural and expected as that of a family dog, yet with an intensity that felt anything but natural. An initial, professional unease began to curdle into a deeper, more personal disquiet. It was in the way Elder Kale, the village spokesman, had smiled, a thin, lipless stretching of the mouth that did not reach his ancient, knowing eyes. It was in the subtle but pervasive physical oddities he began to note. A man with a spine that curved in a gentle, permanent arc, a woman whose gait had a distinct, rolling hitch, another whose fingers seemed just a little too long as she gestured. He had initially attributed it to generations of isolation and the potential for a limited gene pool, a common enough phenomenon in such places. But the sheer consistency of the peculiarities, paired with the profound, almost sacred connection to the horses, suggested a different, more complex story. His curiosity, the very engine of his life's work, now felt like a dangerous flame in a room filled with dry tinder. He asked careful, general questions about their history, about the founding of Havenwood, and was met with answers that were smooth, rehearsed, and utterly devoid of detail. When he gently probed about the horses, about their significance beyond mere labor, a wall of polite but firm resistance descended. Kale's wariness was a palpable force, a silent warning to tread lightly. Dr. Eris understood then that he was not merely studying a culture. He was standing at the edge of a secret, one so deeply buried and fiercely protected that his very presence was a threat. The idyllic, isolated village was a fortress, and he had just walked, uninvited, into its keep. Dr. Eris moved through the village with the deliberate care of a man navigating a field of hidden snares. Each interaction was a delicate excavation, his anthropological training a thin shield against the pervasive sense of wrongness that clung to Havenwood like the valley's perpetual mist. He began with the more approachable villagers, the younger men and women who seemed less ossified by tradition than their elders. He found them at the communal well, their movements economical and synchronized, a silent ballet of shared routine. He noted the physical tells immediately, cataloging them with a clinical eye that barely masked his growing unease. A young man drawing water had a neck thick with corded muscle, his head held with a stiff, proud carriage that was almost equine. His shoulders rolled with a powerful, deliberate motion as he hauled the bucket up. Another, mending a fence, had legs that were disproportionately thick and bowed, his stance wide and solid as if bracing against an invisible pull. Dr. Eris made polite inquiries about crop rotation and seasonal festivals, but his gaze kept returning to their bodies, to the subtle and not-so-subtle echoes of the stable that resonated in their very forms. His mind, trained to find patterns, settled on the most logical, if tragic, conclusion: generations of isolation and severe inbreeding. It was a closed system, a gene pool shrinking upon itself, producing these predictable, if extreme, physical regressions. The theory was clean, academic, and it allowed him to momentarily dismiss the deeper, more primal disquiet that whispered this was something else entirely. His most significant encounter was with the girl from the stable, Elara. She was skittish, her large, dark eyes darting away from his the moment he approached, a nervous twitch jerking her chin to the side. She was brushing down the same broad-chested draft horse he'd seen her with before, her elongated fingers moving through its coat with a strange, spidery grace. He asked her about the horse's name, about its temperament, simple questions meant to put her at ease. Her answers were soft, monosyllabic, but he saw the intelligence in her eyes, a keen awareness that was at odds with her withdrawn demeanor. For Elara, the outsider's presence was a crack of light in the tomb of her world. Dr. Eris was not like the men of Havenwood. He stood straight, his movements were loose and unburdened, and his eyes held no trace of the stable mind or the heavy weight of inherited shame. He represented a world where people did not limp, where fingers were not too long, and where nights were spent in silence. As she spoke to him, a dangerous, intoxicating hope began to bloom in her chest. He was a potential escape, a key that might fit the lock of her cage. She imagined confessing everything to him, the whispers in her mind that were not her own, the terror of the ritual, the hidden shame of her bloodline. He was an anthropologist, he studied people. Perhaps he could understand. Perhaps he could save her. But their conversation was not private. From the shadowed doorway of the bakehouse, Elder Kale watched them, his gnarled hands resting on his cane. His gaze was a physical pressure, a warning that settled over the courtyard. Other elders seemed to materialize from the mist itself, their presence a silent, coordinated surveillance. They did not interrupt, did not speak, but their watchfulness was a wall being built around Dr. Eris, ensuring his inquiries remained shallow, his understanding incomplete. The tension was a fine wire strung taut across the village, vibrating with the unspoken conflict between the doctor's scholarly curiosity, Elara's desperate hope, and the elder's ancient, fearful resolve to keep their cursed legacy hidden from the light. The scent of decaying paper and forgotten years filled Dr. Eris's nostrils as he carefully lifted the first leather-bound journal from the dusty archive shelf. The village elders had granted him access to this small, windowless room with palpable reluctance, presenting it as a repository of mundane agricultural records and weather logs. But Liam Eris had spent a lifetime learning to read the spaces between words, to sense the weight of secrets in the tilt of a head or the hesitation of a hand. The elder's very reluctance had been a beacon, drawing him to this place with the certainty of a bloodhound on a scent. The first journal was indeed filled with tedious accounts of harvest yields and livestock counts. The ink faded to a ghostly brown. But as he moved to the later volumes, the tone began to shift. The neat, bureaucratic script gave way to a more hurried, personal hand. He found his first clue not in a confession, but in a margin note from what appeared to be a community ledger, dated some 7 generations back. Beside a list of family names, a different hand had scrawled, * Marta's boy, Kale, shows the bend. Pray it strengthens him * the word bend was underlined twice. Eris's pulse quickened. He thought of Elder Kale's own stooped posture, the visible curve of his spine. This was not a new development. He pulled another volume, this one clearly a personal diary belonging to a long-dead village matriarch. The entries began with the same rationalizations he had heard from Kale, the bond, the shared strength, the blessings of resilience. But as the pages turned, the language grew more fearful, more desperate. Elwyn's daughter will not wear shoes. One entry read, *, she cries that they pinch her feet, but her toes, they are not right, they are hardening. We keep her inside *, another. A few years later, * more of the children startle at thunder as the horses do. Their minds are not their own in these moments. We must be stronger in our faith. The bond is our salvation star. The horror began as a cold knot in Eris's stomach, tightening with each turned page. The community's early concealment efforts were laid bare in these frantic scribbles. They were not hiding from outsiders, there were none but from themselves. They documented the increasing deformities with a clinical detachment that barely masked a rising tide of panic, always followed by a fervent reaffirmation of their sacred practice. It was a cycle of observation, denial, and reinforcement, a psychological prison they had built around themselves. Then he found the drawings. Tucked between the pages of a ledger was a folded piece of vellum, brittle with age. Unfolding it carefully, his breath caught in his throat. It was a rough anatomical sketch, depicting the skeleton of a human leg. But the bones of the foot were fused, elongated, transforming unmistakably into the structure of a hoof. Neat, precise notations labeled the changes in bone density and joint structure. This was not the work of a frightened farmer. This was a studied, horrified observation. Someone, generations ago, had understood exactly what was happening to their bodies. They had documented the physical transformation even as the community's oral tradition mythologized it. The bed-sharing practice was not just a cultural oddity. It was the engine of this slow, generational metamorphosis. The pieces of the horrifying puzzle were falling into place, and the picture they formed was one of a people willingly, ritualistically, breeding themselves into something other than human. The final journal was the key, its cover stained dark with age and something that looked unsettlingly like old sweat. Dr. Eris's hands trembled as he opened it, the brittle pages threatening to crumble at his touch. The entries here were no longer veiled in metaphor or desperate faith. They were stark, clinical, and horrifyingly specific. The author, a man named Theron from 5 generations past, had not been a farmer but a man of some learning, perhaps even a self-taught physician. He wrote of the nightly communion not as a blessing, but as a biological catastrophe. Theron's script was a frantic scrawl, detailing observations made in secret. He described how prolonged, intimate contact with the horses night after night was causing a transference of essence. He documented cases of osseous pliancy in children, their bones softening and reshaping under the subtle, constant pressure and warmth of the equine body. He wrote of a sympathetic resonance in the nervous system, where human minds began to mirror the flight-or-fight instincts of their stablemates, leading to the skittishness and sudden rages Eris had witnessed. The most damning entry was a list correlating specific families' bed-sharing habits with the severity of the deformities in their offspring. The evidence was irrefutable, a damning genetic ledger. The ritual was not merely a tradition. It was a slow-acting poison, a deliberate environmental pressure warping their very DNA across generations. The sound of the archive door creaking open shattered the heavy silence. Dr. Eris snapped the journal shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. Elder Kale stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the weak afternoon light. The old man's face was a mask of cold fury, his knuckles white where they gripped his cane. He did not need to ask what Eris had found. The truth was written plainly on the anthropologist's horrified face. "You tread on sacred ground, outsider." Kale's voice was a low, dangerous rasp, devoid of its earlier practiced courtesy. He took a limping step into the room, his curved spine making him seem to loom despite his stoop. "Those are not for your eyes. They are the fears of a weak man, a heretic who lost his faith in the bond." Eris stood his ground, the journal held tight. "This isn't faith, it's a documented medical tragedy. You've known. For generations. You've known what this was doing to your people." "We survive," Kale hissed, his composure cracking to reveal the raw, desperate conviction beneath. "It is the price. A price our ancestors were willing to pay, and one we continue to pay for the strength to endure in this place. It is our way. It is who we are." Unseen by either man, a shadow shifted in the narrow corridor outside the slightly ajar door. Elara had come to the archives, drawn by a restless need to understand the outsider's purpose, to see if his books held the answers her grandmother would not give. She stood frozen now, pressed against the cold stone wall, Kale's hissed words and Eris's quiet, horrified rebuttal searing into her mind. The phrase, documented medical tragedy, echoed in her skull, giving a terrifying, clinical name to the ache in her bones and the whispers in her thoughts. The elders had not just hidden the truth. They had weaponized it, turning a curse into a creed. Her loyalty to Havenwood, to her family, warred with a cold, expanding fear. They had all been living a lie, a beautiful, terrible lie that was written in the very marrow of their bones. And the man in the archive held the proof that could shatter their world forever. The truth did not settle gently into Dr. Eris's mind. It struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless and reeling in the musty silence of the archive. The confrontation with Cale had ended in a stalemate of seething tension, the elder retreating with a final, venomous glare that promised consequences. But the threat was a distant buzz compared to the roaring certainty now consuming Eris's thoughts. He remained in the small, dusty room, the damning journals spread before him like a prosecutor's evidence, and he allowed the full, horrifying picture to assemble itself. It was not merely inbreeding. That theory, once so clinically convenient, now seemed laughably naive. The patterns in Theron's journal were too precise, the correlations too direct. The deformities were not random regressions. They were targeted adaptations. The bowed legs for stability, the thickened necks for power, the fused bones in the feet. They were not flaws but functional, if grotesque, refinements. The 10-generation practice of bed sharing had not been a passive tradition. It had been an active, relentless environmental pressure, a form of unnatural selection conducted in the intimate dark of the stables. Generation by generation, the prolonged, cellular-level exposure to the horses had done more than warp bone and sinew. It had invited a foreign essence into their very genetic code, a slow, parasitic weaving of equine DNA into the human helix. His mind, trained to trace cause and effect through the fog of culture and myth, now followed this new, terrible logic to its ultimate conclusion. The mental degradation Cale had dismissed as a loss of faith was the most chilling part of the equation. It was not a psychological break. It was a biological takeover. The stable mind was not a metaphor. The shared warmth, the whispered secrets, the very rhythm of breathing in sync. These were not just bonding rituals. They were a conduit, a bridge across which equine instincts could migrate. The skittishness, the sudden rages, the moments of heavy-lidded stillness. These were not human emotions distorted, but pure, undiluted horse behavior emerging from a corrupted consciousness. The villagers were not losing their minds. They were sharing them, their human psyches slowly being overwritten by a more primal, herd-based operating system. A cold sweat broke out on his brow as he thought of Alara. Her elongated fingers, her nervous twitch, the profound, unspoken understanding in her eyes when she looked at her horse. They were not just symptoms. They were the early warning signs of a mind already beginning to bifurcate, a human soul preparing its stable for a second equine tenant. The Bloodlines curse was not a supernatural affliction. It was a scientifically plausible, horrifyingly slow transmutation. The people of Havenwood were not cursed by gods or ghosts. They were cursed by their own ancestors' desperate pact, a bargain for survival that had cost them their very humanity. They were becoming a new species, a tragic hybrid forged not in a lab, but in the straw of their own beds, and the most terrifying part was that after 10 generations, the process was likely irreversible. The mutation was now the baseline, the curse woven so deeply into their DNA that it was no longer a foreign invader, but the foundation of their very being. The weight of the unspoken truth became a physical presence in the days that followed, a specter that walked beside Alara, its cold breath on her neck as she went through the motions of her life. The confrontation in the archive had shattered the fragile illusion of normalcy, and the village, once a haven, now felt like a gilded cage whose bars were closing in. Every glance from Elder Cale was an accusation, every whispered conversation among the elders a confirmation of the conspiracy. But it was the noise inside her own head that was the true torment. It had started as a faint hum, a background static of foreign thought, but since the outsider's arrival, it had swelled into a chorus of whinnies, snorts, and the simple, powerful impulses of the herd: fear, hunger, the need for flight. She was no longer just Alara. She was a vessel, and the horses were pouring into her. She found Dr. Eris at the edge of the Whispering Woods, the place where he often went to make notes, his back to the village as if he could not bear to look at it for too long. The mist clung to his coat, and his shoulders were slumped with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. He turned as she approached, his eyes, so sharp and knowing, taking in her trembling hands and the wild, desperate look she could not hide. There were no pleasantries, no carefully constructed questions. The dam within her broke, and the confession poured out in a ragged, breathless torrent. She told him of the fear that was her constant companion, a cold stone in her gut. She spoke of the whispers, not from other villagers, but from inside her own mind. The panicked urge to bolt at a slamming door that was not her own. The sudden, vivid image of sweetgrass in a far meadow that would flash behind her eyes. The profound sense of calm that settled over her when she stood with the herd. A feeling of belonging that was both comforting and horrifying. She was hearing the horse minds, their simple, powerful consciousness bleeding into hers, and she was losing the ability to tell where their thoughts ended and hers began. Then, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper, she revealed the village's most guarded secret, the one not written in any journal. She spoke of the ones who had gone too far, the villagers who had fully succumbed to the stable mind. There was old man Gryff, who no longer spoke, but communicated in guttural snorts and would spend hours pacing the pasture fence line with a restless, caged energy. There was Anwen's mother, who had retreated into a wordless existence after her daughter's birth, her eyes holding a placid, animal emptiness as she sat in the sun, her fingers constantly plucking at the grass beside her. They were feral, their humanity eroded away, leaving behind only the instincts and needs of the horse. They were the future, she sobbed, the living proof of the bloodline's end point, and she could feel the same pull in her own blood, a siren song toward that silent, simple oblivion. This emotional outpouring was not just a sharing of secrets. It was a desperate plea for redemption. She confessed to him that she had wanted to warn him away, to protect the village's cursed way of life, but now she saw it for the prison it was. She did not want to become one of the feral ones, a ghost haunting her own body. She wanted to be saved, not just from the village, but from the thing she was becoming. In her raw, unfiltered terror, she laid bare the profound mental consequences of the bond, consequences far more terrifying than any physical deformity. The confession was an act of purging, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim her own mind before the whispers from the stable consumed it completely. The tension in Havenwood did not simmer. It curdled, thickening the air until every breath felt like a struggle. The confrontation in the archives and Alara's subsequent confession had torn away the last pretense of normalcy, leaving the village's festering secret exposed to the harsh, unflinching light of understanding. The elders moved through the mist-shrouded lanes with a new, grim purpose, their whispers sharp and their gazes hunting. The community, once a unified front of shared denial, now fractured along the invisible fault lines of fear and knowledge. And in the center of this escalating storm was Caden, a man whose body and mind had become the brutal, living embodiment of the Bloodline's price. Caden had been a quiet, hulking presence for years, his spine so severely curved, he could no longer look a person in the eye, his gait a heavy, rolling shuffle. But in recent months, the last vestiges of his speech had dissolved into guttural grunts, and a new, dangerous restlessness had taken hold of him. He spent his days in the high pasture with the wildest of the horses, not tending them, but moving among them as one of their own, his head lowered, his thick-fingered hands brushing the ground. The stable mind had claimed him completely. The chaos erupted at the communal well. Dr. Eris was attempting to speak with a group of younger villagers, his voice low and urgent, explaining the genetic truth he had uncovered. Alara stood slightly behind him, her face a pale mask of anguish, her elongated fingers twisting together. It was then that Caden appeared at the edge of the square. He did not walk, he charged. His head was thrown back, a raw, whinnying scream tearing from his throat, a sound that was neither human nor animal, but a horrifying fusion of both. His eyes, wide and rolling with a panicked fury, were fixed on Eris, the outsider, the source of the disruption. He moved with a terrifying horse-like rage, his powerful, bowed legs propelling him forward in a series of jarring, unbalanced lunges. He did not throw a punch. He lowered his head and rammed his shoulder into a young man who tried to block his path, sending the villager sprawling into the dust with a sickening crunch. The square erupted into screams. Caden reared back, his feet, clad only in the soft leather wrappings that could not fully conceal their hoof-like shape, pawing at the air before crashing down and scattering a cluster of women. Dr. Eris instinctively stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture, his anthropologist's mind racing to de-escalate the primal fury before him. Alara cried out, not in fear for herself, but for the doctor, and for the man Caden had once been. She rushed to Eris's side, her own body trembling with a sympathetic, instinctual terror that mirrored the chaos. They tried to form a barrier, to speak calm words into the storm, but their intervention was a spark on tinder. The community's reaction was instantaneous and brutal. They did not see two people trying to prevent violence. They saw the outsider and the traitorous heir siding against one of their own. The fear and hostility that had been brewing for weeks boiled over. A rock flew from the crowd, clipping Eris on the shoulder. A woman shrieked at Alara, calling her a deserter, a blight on her bloodline. The elders, led by a furious Kale, did not try to calm Caden. They turned their venom on the interlopers. The violence reached its climax as two of the larger villagers seized Dr. Eris, pinning his arms, while another grabbed a handful of Alara's hair, yanking her back with a snarl. In that moment of struggling, pinned violence, the full, grotesque depth of the deformity was exposed for all to see. As the villager wrestled with Alara, the sleeve of his tunic ripped, revealing an arm that was not just muscular, but structurally altered. The skin from his elbow to his wrist was covered in a patch of rough, thickened hide, like the callous skin on a horse's leg, dotted with sparse, coarse hairs. It was not a birthmark or a scar. It was a transformation, a piece of equine anatomy grafted onto a human frame. The sight stilled the struggle for a heartbeat. This was no longer a matter of bent spines or long fingers. This was a fundamental rewriting of flesh, a horrifying testament to how deep the curse ran, and a chilling preview of the monstrous future awaiting them all. The air in Havenwood was no longer just heavy with mist. It was thick with the scent of fear and betrayal, a palpable poison that made every breath a labor. The violent standoff at the well had severed the last frayed threads of civility, transforming the secluded village from a sanctuary into a prison whose guards were their own kin. Alara and Dr. Eris knew their time had run out. To remain was to be absorbed back into the silent, suffocating dogma of the elders, or worse, to succumb to the feral madness that had claimed Caden. Their only hope, a fragile and desperate one, lay beyond the whispering woods, in a world that might not believe their horrifying tale, but which offered the only chance for a future not written in straw and animal instinct. They moved under the cover of a moonless, starless night, the darkness their only ally. The village was eerily quiet, the usual nocturnal sounds of the forest swallowed by an unnatural hush, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Alara led the way, her body thrumming with a nervous energy that was part her own terror and part the panicked flight impulse bleeding from the stables into her mind. Her elongated fingers trembled as she gestured for Eris to follow a path only she knew, a deer trail that skirted the main thoroughfares. He moved behind her, his city-bred footsteps clumsy on the uneven ground, his mind reeling with the genetic horrors he now knew to be true. Their plan was simple. Reach the old logging road on the far side of the woods, find his abandoned jeep, and drive until the mist was a memory. For the first 100 yards, hope was a fragile flame in their chests. The trees closed around them, their skeletal branches offering a semblance of cover. But Havenwood's isolation was not merely geographical. It was a state of being, a collective consciousness that guarded its secrets with a preternatural vigilance. They had not gone half a mile when the shadows ahead began to shift and coalesce. Figures emerged from behind the thick trunks, not with the noisy pursuit of hunters, but with the silent, inevitable convergence of a closing net. It was Elder Kale, his bent form held with a terrible authority, flanked by Boren and others whose deformities were starkly visible in the deep gloom. The rolling gaits, the thickened necks, the eyes that held a cold, communal judgment. There was no command shouted, no demand for their return. The elders and the villagers with them simply stood, blocking the path, a living wall of tradition and twisted flesh. Their silence was more terrifying than any threat. It was the silence of the stable, of a herd that has identified a threat and moved as one to neutralize it. Behind them, from the direction of the village, came the sound of more footsteps, a clumsy, shuffling cadence that could only belong to those like Caden, whose humanity had been all but erased. They were surrounded, the isolation of Havenwood proving to be not just a barrier to the outside world, but a trap from which there was no easy exit. A desperate, primal energy seized Alara. She grabbed Eris's arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulled him off the path, plunging them into the deeper, more treacherous undergrowth. The chase was on. It was not a sprint, but a frantic, stumbling flight through a labyrinth of grasping thorns and hidden roots. The woods, once a place of childhood exploration, were now a hostile territory, every snapped twig sounding like a gunshot in the tense silence. They could hear their pursuers now, not running, but moving with a steady, relentless pace, their distorted bodies seemingly unhindered by the dense foliage. The villagers knew this land with the intimacy of 10 generations. They were an extension of the forest itself. The tension was a wire drawn taut in Alara's soul, vibrating with every gasped breath. This was more than an escape. It was a severing. Each step away from the village was a step away from her name, her blood, the only identity she had ever known. The desperation was a cold fire in her veins, fueled by the image of the feral ones and the terrifying knowledge that their fate was hers if she stayed. Dr. Eris's desperation was different, a chilling, academic horror at the confirmation of his theories. This was a community so isolated, so warped by its own secret, that it would rather consume its own than allow the truth to escape. The woods themselves seemed to press in, the gnarled trees like the bent spines of her ancestors, the rustling leaves a chorus of whispers urging her to surrender, to return to the warm, simple darkness of the stable. But she ran on, the frantic beat of her heart a counter-rhythm to the steady, ominous drum of the pursuit, a lone, desperate creature fleeing the only home she had ever known, a home that had become a beautiful, monstrous lie. The frantic dash through the woods ended not in the open freedom of the logging road, but in a cruel, circular trap. The hidden paths Alara had relied upon, the secret ways known only to the young and the rebellious, had all been sealed by the silent, coordinated efforts of their pursuers. They were herded, like straying sheep, back toward the heart of the village, emerging from the tree line not into escape, but into the central clearing where the entire population of Havenwood stood waiting. The scene was lit by the flickering, hellish glow of torches, their dancing light carving grotesque shadows from the faces of the assembled crowd, highlighting the curves of spines, the length of limbs, the profound, unsettling stillness of their gazes. They were a gallery of living consequences, a silent jury for the two who had dared to challenge their reality. Dr. Eris's first instinct was for the outside world, for the rational order that lay beyond the mist. His hand went to the satellite phone in his coat pocket, a slim, black lifeline. His thumb found the power button, but the screen remained obstinately dark. He tried the emergency beacon, the GPS, nothing. No signal bars, no flicker of connection. He looked up and met Elder Kale's eyes across the clearing. The old man's lips were pressed into a thin, knowing line. The jamming was not some sophisticated technology. It was the valley itself, the oppressive weight of the mountains and the thick, ionized air, amplified by something older and more malevolent, the collective will of a people who had spent 10 generations ensuring their secrets remained their own. The silence from the device was more final than any shouted threat. They were truly, utterly alone. With the pretense of civility stripped away, Eris turned to face the elders. He stood before Kale, Boren, and the other grim-faced patriarchs, the damning knowledge from the journals giving his voice a raw, unflinching power. He did not accuse, he stated. He spoke of Theron's observations, of the osseous pliancy and the sympathetic resonance, of the documented generational decay. He laid out the horrifying genetic truth like a coroner laying out evidence on a slab, each fact a scalpel cutting through 2 centuries of lies. Kale did not deny it. He stood, a monument to the very deformities Eris described. His curved spine a testament to the price paid. But his admission was not one of shame. It was a declaration of faith. His voice, though raspy, was imbued with a fervent, unshakable conviction. He spoke of survival, of the strength the bond had given them to endure in a land that would have otherwise killed them. He defended the twisted limbs and unstable minds not as a curse, but as a heritage, a sacred sacrifice made by each generation for the one that followed. The horror, to him, was not in the transformation, but in the outsider's desire to strip it of its meaning, to reduce their profound, hard-won identity to a mere medical anomaly. The standoff that followed was a collision of two irreconcilable truths. On one side stood the cold, clinical horror of scientific fact, represented by a man who saw a tragedy in need of correction. On the other stood the warm, terrible beauty of a lived mythology, defended by men and women who saw their very bodies as a testament to their ancestors' will. The moral ambiguity hung thick in the torchlit air. Was this a community to be saved from itself, or a unique culture whose self-destruction was its own sacred right? The villagers watched, their faces a mosaic of fear, anger, and a deep, unsettling agreement with their elders. They were not monsters. They were a people who had made a choice, long ago, to embrace a slow metamorphosis, and in that moment the true horror was not the deformities themselves, but the chilling realization that, given the same desperate choice, one might have done the same. The line between salvation and damnation had been blurred beyond recognition, lost in the whispering mist of Havenwood. The arrival of the authorities was not a rescue, but a clinical extraction. They came in vehicles the color of bleached bone, their movements efficient and dispassionate, sealing the valley with a quarantine that felt less like a barrier and more like a lid placed on a jar containing something unspeakable. For Dr. Eris, watching from the periphery as men in sterile white coveralls moved through the mist, it was the culmination of his life's work, and its utter failure. He had sought to understand, to document, to preserve a unique culture. Instead, he had exposed it, and in doing so had presided over its dissection. The guilt was a cold, heavy stone in his gut, a weight that no amount of academic justification could lift. He had pulled back the curtain on a tragedy, but he had also shattered the only reality these people had ever known, and the destruction he saw in the stunned, vacant eyes of the villagers felt like a personal sin. Alara was processed with the others, a number scrawled on a tag around her wrist, her personal effects, a simple hair tie, a smooth stone she'd kept in her pocket, sealed in a plastic bag. She did not struggle as she was led away from the only home she had ever known, from the stables that smelled of hay and horse and generations of whispered secrets. Her fate was a question mark, a line on a form to be filled in by faceless officials in a distant office. Would she be studied, a living specimen of her bloodline's curse? Would she be placed in some anonymous care facility, her strange limbs and twitching head hidden from a world that would never understand? As the transport vehicle door slammed shut, sealing her in a sterile metallic darkness, her reflection was a ghost in the window, a girl with 2 long fingers and eyes that held the echo of whinnies. She had sought the truth, and the truth had annihilated her world. Uncovering the secrets of Havenwood had not brought freedom. It had only exchanged one kind of prison for another, and the destruction left in its wake felt absolute. The facility was a monument to silence, a place where sound went to die. Dr. Eris walked its gleaming, antiseptic corridors, the squeak of his shoes on the linoleum a vulgar intrusion in the pervasive hush. It had been years since the quarantine of Havenwood, years since the reports had been filed, the studies published, the brief, sensational headlines had faded into obscurity. The world had moved on, but for Eris, the valley and its people were a ghost limb, an ache that never fully subsided. He had come today not as an anthropologist, but as a penitent, drawn back to the living evidence of his most profound failure. They led him to a sunroom, a space of such brutal, cheerful brightness it felt like a mockery. And there she was, in the center of the room, standing in a patch of artificial light. Alara, or what was left of her. The sight struck him with a physical force, stealing the air from his lungs. The young woman he had known, the one with the desperate, intelligent eyes and the nervously twitching chin, was gone. In her place stood a creature of profound and terrible ambiguity. Her spine was a permanent, graceful arch, her neck elongated and thick with ropey muscle, holding her head at an angle that was purely equine. Her hair, once dark and long, had been shorn to a short, practical crop, but it did little to hide the way her skull seemed to have subtly reshaped itself, the bones of her jaw and cheeks broader, stronger. She stood not on the balls of her feet, but on what could only be described as the precursors to hooves. Her feet had fully fused and hardened into dark, callous stumps, encased in soft medical boots. But it was her hands, resting on a support bar, that held his gaze the longest. The fingers, always too long, had lost their human delicacy. They were thick, powerful things, the joints knobbed and immobile, the skin rough and leathery, more suited for pawing the earth than for human touch. She did not look at him as he approached. Her focus was entirely on the world outside the large, unopenable window, her large brown eyes, still so familiar, yet now so empty of human cognition, tracking the flight of a bird with a simple animal intensity. There was no spark of recognition, no flicker of the mind that had once confessed its terror to him in the whispering woods. When a nurse made a soft sound, Alara's head jerked up, her ears, her human ears, seeming to pivot instinctively toward the noise, a gesture so purely equine it made his stomach clench. She let out a soft, breathy sigh, a sound that was not a word, not a sigh of sadness or contentment, but the simple exhalation of a creature occupying space, unaware of its own tragedy. Eris stood there, a spectator at the end of a road he had helped pave. He reflected on the immense cost of isolation, the terrible power of a taboo so deeply woven into a culture that it becomes indistinguishable from identity. Havenwood had chosen its path, a slow-motion suicide pact disguised as tradition, a defense against a world they feared by embracing a deformation they called a bond. He had believed knowledge was a light that could dispel any darkness, but the light he had brought to Havenwood had only revealed a horror so complete it offered no redemption, only a clinical, sterile ending in a sunlit room. He left without speaking, the image of her burned onto his retina. The legacy of Havenwood was not in a published paper or a closed case file. It was here, in this creature that was barely human, a living testament to the fact that some secrets, once unearthed, do not set anyone free. They simply reveal the shape of the cage and the dark, irreversible truth of what we can become when we choose to live in the stable and forget how to walk in the sun.